Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2 from our textbook, National Differences in Political, Economic, and Legal Systems. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. This is a really fun chapter. When I took this course in college, it was actually not called International Business, but it was called IPE, International Political Economy. And this chapter is a really nice introduction to the course that I took and the course that we'll be talking about this semester. So let's go ahead and get started. There are 4 major learning objectives, and the first 3 are the most important parts for this chapter. First, we're going to understand the political systems. That'll be part 1 of the video. Then I'll stop the video and do a separate video doing the second learning objective, the economic systems. And then I'll do a third video talking about the legal systems. And then also including that third video, there'll be some also explanations about the implications for management practices of these national differences in the political economy and how that is a reference back to you as future managers. So the opening case I found was super interesting because obviously very relevant. We talk about here China's mixed economy, right? And I thought it was a really nice history lesson to talk about how China used to be a one-party state where the private enterprise was banned and business activity was totally controlled by the government. But now market-oriented reforms have now come into China, and it's become the second largest economy in the world, if not soon the first, right? But at the same time, it's still a one-party state, but now it's considered a social market economy. And we'll talk about China again and again in this course and definitely in this chapter, right? Because it is traditionally communist, but now because they privatized so many businesses, it's really in this gray area. There's a mixed economy with a very vibrant private sector and a significant state-owned sector. When we started this, when China started this privatization, that happened all in the 1950s, and now it's only been since the 1970s that it's become the second largest economy in the world. So I thought that was really interesting that it's very, very recent, right? In the last 40, 50 years, that China has become such a prominent player in the world. And and that those private companies are names that we very much know, or at least I know, right? Alibaba, Huawei, right, in telecom, and the organizations that are still state-owned, I think are important to know which industries those are. It's banking and transportation. But the private organizations in China have erupted now in the IT industry, in the hotel industry, and in agriculture. The last piece on this slide, I think, is also really relevant, that China's state-owned enterprises are much less productive than the private sector businesses, no matter how much support they receive from the state. And so we'll talk a lot about that in this chapter, right? The benefits and the pros and the cons to state versus privately owned organizations. The next slide here just shows a visual on, a worker handling hot cables. So, industrial activity in China and in a steel factory, right? And I think that after this textbook was published, steel became an even more hot issue, right? And that's really kind of been the prelude to what we're going on now. That the book said that Obama started it, putting steel tariffs on China exports because they are state subsidized, so they just have so much steel, and they were really hampering the world production, especially the U.S. production of steel, making it just so cheap to import it. And then the U.S. companies were having problems keeping up. And then Trump went further, right, putting on further tariffs, and that started this tension, right, between the U.S. and China. And now that has just really kind of, let's say, exploded, right? We could talk all day about the tensions between the US and China, but I just thought it was worth a moment to talk about the history and how we got here from just a few years ago when this whole steel tariff issue started. And that, really important to know and understand that China heavily supports the private industry. So if it's not running a private business, it's supporting. a private industry. And that's why like the telecom company Huawei has gotten subsidized by the Chinese government by $30 billion. And the biggest competitive to Huawei is Cisco, and which is an American company, right? And Cisco has only been subsidized by the US by 45 million, right? So comparing, right, 30 billion to 45 million, right? And so in many ways, how can Cisco even compete to Huawei? And so as you can see, that is why the US has put tariffs or banned a lot of these Chinese products to come in, just because they feel that that would not be fair to organizations like Cisco, because Huawei is just so big and so powerful. And that's why in the United States, we don't have those products. So let's get more into the nitty gritty as to what the difference is between the US and China when we talk about first political systems. So international business, right? It's more complicated than domestic business, right? Because now we're talking about differing political, legal, and economic systems. They all vary in economic development and growth trajectories. There are cultural, education, and skill levels that are different. And as I said, these legal systems are known as the political economy. So as I said, when I took international business, we didn't call it international business because I got my MBA in anything and everything we studied was international business, but we took a course specifically on these topics that we're studying now. And the course was called IPE, International Political Economy. And actually, when I took it, we had to focus on one particular area of the world. So you could either focus on Latin America or Asia or Europe. And so you had to choose at the beginning of your MBA what area you wanted to focus on. And that's the area that you would study for the rest of your 2 years. So I took IPE, studying only Europe, actually, because that was my interest at the time. So going back to why we call it IPE is because systems are interdependent. Societal culture affects the political economy, and political economy shapes the societal culture. One thing that I wanted to say was that, right, these systems are interdependent because they interact and they influence each other. And we just need to understand, that when it comes to China and many different somewhat communist countries, that the private organizations are subsidized by the state, which really affects how we all do business. So let's talk about going into detail of the political systems, right? The political system is the system of government in a nation. The political systems assessed in terms of degree into which they're two areas: emphasize collectivism as opposed to individualism, and are democratic or totalitarianism. And you'll say, hey, there's some overlap in those ideas. And you're right, that very often, right, collectivism and totalitarianism are together in one boat, and individualism, just like here in this country, and democracy are in one boat. That happens very, very often, and we'll get into where that shows up here in the next couple of slides. There is a gray area, as I mentioned already, right? China is a little bit of a gray area, but there are, in theory, two major dimensions. So here, collectivism and individualism, what does that mean? Hopefully you're already somewhat familiar with this, right? But collectivism is a system that stresses the primacy of collective goals over individual goals. This is back to Plato. He said that society should be stratified into different classes, right? So already you should get a red flag, right? This doesn't sound right, not from what we're familiar here in the US. Property should be owned in common. When collectivism is emphasized, the needs of society are generally viewed as being more important than individual freedoms. He felt that those best suited to rule should administer the society for the benefit of all. And he was a little bit biased. He felt that the philosophers and the soldiers should be the people that made the big decisions for all of society, right? His main idea was that we were talking about the good of the majority. Okay, and so then we move into socialism. And so that's like a subset, right, of this collectivism. And socialists are those who believe in public ownership of the means of production for the common good of society. Karl Marx is the big cheerleader for this idea. Advocates state that ownership of basic means of production, distribution, and exchange, right? So those are like the three major pieces of business. And he's saying that, that the government should own all these pieces. Then he states that, then manages enterprises to benefit society as a whole. And so he believed that capitalists, unfortunately, would keep all the money, he felt, and not give the workers their true value. And so that's why he felt that the government should own everything. Obviously, in a couple slides, we'll see that that's not actually the case. That's not really the truth or what happens with human nature, but that's what his beliefs were. And so in the early 20th century, then socialism then split into two major ideas. First, we had communism, right, where we believe that socialism could only be achieved through violent revolution and total dictatorship. And thankfully, by the mid-1990s, after '89, when the Berlin Wall came down, the world changed for the better, right? And now, ever since then, mostly this only really exists in North Korea, thank goodness. But we also still have a lot of social democrats, and these are people who work to achieve the same goals, but by democratic means. That they were saying that many state-owned enterprises failed to succeed, and many nations implemented privatization programs, and that the sale of these state-owned enterprises moved to private investors. And we see this showing up actually still in places like Finland and Sweden, and even in France, you could say, is a social democracy. So, right, if you've ever lived in one of those countries or visited some of those countries, like you see that there are a lot of rules, right? Taxes are high. A lot of things are owned by the government, right? But we definitely don't classify them as communism. We can even say that Great Britain, right, in the 1970s, they had a monopoly on a lot of industries, telecom, the airlines, etc., and they too were classified as a social democracy. Since then, they've definitely moved away from that. But as I said, a lot of countries still move in this direction. So let's now talk about the other side. So individualism. This is where private property is highly protective. This suggests that individuals should have freedom over economic and political pursuits. This is traced back to Aristotle. When you take your business ethics course, right, this is all about these ideas that he argued that individual diversity and private ownership are desirable. And some of these names hopefully should sound familiar, right? David Hume, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill. So these philosophers came in and said, hey, I think that individuals have a right, and they also have influence over how society moves forward and progresses. So individualism here stresses individual freedom, self-expression, and letting people pursue, this is my favorite bullet point maybe in this whole deck, right? Pursue self-interests to achieve the best overall good for society. And why I'm so passionate about that is because I had this mantra growing up. As you all know, my mother's from the Czech Republic. She grew up under the communists, and she came here in 1968 when she was 19. And so she just felt like, living in the United States now for the last 50 years, it is so evident to her that a capitalist society really empowers people to own their own businesses, do things that they want to do, and then they go out and they make more money and they move businesses forward, and Silicon Valley happens and there are new inventions, etc. And so it's just really, really exciting to see how right individualism can affect the political system, and as we've seen, right, societies that are moving forward faster implement these types of ideas. And so as the last bullet point here, right, democratic systems and free markets. So when we talk about here, I just want to say on that last slide, right, that we still have a lot of countries that are in that area that swang towards socialism even after the 1990s. Since 2005, Venezuela, we can't forget about, right? Venezuela, Bolivia, Paraguay have unfortunately swung back a little bit to these communist ideas. So now let's talk about political systems, democracy and totalitarianism, right? This is a political system in which government is by the people, exercised either directly or through elected representatives. The most common form is representative democracy. Elected representatives vote on behalf of the constituents. And their democracy and totalitarianism, right, are different ends of a spectrum, but there's also some gray area in there, as I said before, like China, for example. And in a minute, we'll talk a little bit about Russia as well and how they've swung kind of back and now forth, or should I say forth and now back. Right. And so there's in democracy and totalitarianism, there's a freedom of expression, opinion, organization, free media, regular elections, etc., fair court system, non-political police force, free access to state information. Diving into totalitarianism here, this is where a form of government in which one person or political party exercises absolute control over all spheres of human life, and opposing political parties are prohibited. So in most totalitarian regimes, there's a widespread political oppression. There are no free and fair elections. Media is censored. Basic liberties are denied, and challenges to the regime are prohibited. And so this is where I want to talk a little bit about Russia, right? Because after 1989, actually they had a brief moment, right, where they opened up and tried to privatize their organizations, but there was unfortunately a lot of corruption during that time. And this quote privatization was taken over by a lot of people who had been in the Communist Party. That even happened in the Czech Republic too. But in Russia, it was to an extreme. And then in 1998, they just, because of their corruption and their lack of being able to smoothly move into a democracy, they had a huge financial crisis. And so that was then an opportunity for the communists to come back in. And as you know, Russia relies heavily for their GDP on oil exports. And then, in 2016, again, looking back into just, 7-8 years ago, the U.S. exports started to hurt their finances because the U.S. decided then that, we shouldn't be supporting Russia already back then. We didn't hear about it that much. We hear about it a lot today, right? But now the U.S. is saying we shouldn't be supporting Russia because they're really moving quickly back into communism. And so we're going to start exporting our own oil. We have a lot of our own oil. And that really plummeted the price of the barrel for oil in Russia. And they've had a hard time, making back up the money that they made before 2016. And obviously now that is moving forward and escalating to a degree that I'm sure we will talk about again and again in this course. So before we get down that rabbit hole, let's just summarize here totalitarianism. There are 4 major parts. Communist totalitarianism. Okay, I feel like I missed a slide here. Hold on. Okay, well, let's keep going. Communist totalitarianism that advocates achieving socialism through totalitarian dictatorship. This is like China and North Korea. Then the next one is theocratic totalitarianism. This is where the political party is monopolized by a party, group, or individual that governs according to religious principles. So this happens mostly these days in Islamic countries, and you can think of Iran and Saudi Arabia, right? Again, Iran coming up more and more in the news these days. Tribal totalitarianism. Tribe should stimulate an idea about Africa. And yes, it's Kenya where this happens very often, and other African countries where a political party represents the interests of a particular tribe and monopolizes power, unfortunately. And then the 4th type of totalitarianism is right-wing totalitarianism. This is where individual economic is allowed, but individual political freedom is restricted because it could lead to communism. Oops. And this is where, fortunately, we don't see this very often anymore. But this is where very often a military power will come in to to rule. And we saw this in the 1930s in Germany with the fascist regimes before World War II. And then we also saw this in Brazil, if you're familiar with Latin American history, from 1964 to 1985. That was a really hard time for Brazil with that military takeover. Good. And so then we also have just one last slide here, pseudo-democracies. So this is where, again, where many nations lie between pure democracy and complete totalitarianism. That authoritarian elements capture much of the machinery state and use this to deny basic political and civil liberties. And so the example that they already give is Russia and Putin again, because in theory, right, Russia has elections, right? Putin was just voted in again, right, in the last couple of years. But in actuality, the elections are rigged from what we understand, and really nobody can truly win. There have been people that run against him and really tried to fight, and they have, riots in the streets and things like this to help push against different issues. But at the end of the day, Putin has total control. Good. And so the next part of our chapter is going to be talking about economic systems, but I will end the video here to give you a little break and look for my next video. I look forward to talking you through economic systems.